Look at this piece of trash. Thinking he owns the pavement. Officer Cedric sneered, kicking the scuffed work boots of the black man handcuffed to the rusted precinct bench. You don't belong in this zip code, boy. Percival didn't flinch. Blood trickled from his split lip, catching the harsh fluorescent light, but his dark eyes were cold, unyielding steel. You have exactly 3 minutes to take these cuffs off, he whispered, his voice dangerously calm. Cedric laughed, a harsh, grating sound echoing off the concrete. Or what? You gonna call your daddy? He had no idea how apocalyptic those words would become. The 42nd precinct smelled of stale coffee, ozone, and decades of unchecked ego. It was a miserable, windowless purgatory where the city's forgotten were dragged to be processed, intimidated, and broken. Percival sat on the wooden bench, the cold, jagged steel of the handcuffs biting mercilessly into his wrists. His broad shoulders were squared, his posture immaculate despite the rip in his faded gray hoodie and the dirt smeared across his dark, striking features. He took a slow, measured breath, cataloging the sharp pain in his ribs where Officer Cedric's nightstick had made contact an hour earlier. The arrest had been a masterpiece of systemic prejudice. Percival had been standing outside the gates of the newly funded Silverline Development Project in the affluent West End, a neighborhood of manicured lawns and exorbitant property taxes. He had been holding a set of rolled blueprints, inspecting the foundational pouring of a site that was secretly bleeding millions in city funds. Cedric had rolled up in his cruiser, lights flashing, and within 90 seconds, Percival was face down on the asphalt. There were no questions asked. There was only the immediate, violent assumption that a black man in work clothes, staring at a luxury site, was either casing it for a robbery or trespassing. I asked you for your ID, and you gave me lip. Cedric had barked as he shoved Percival into the back of the squad car, slamming the door on Percival's shin. Now, in the belly of the precinct, Cedric stood over him, a smirking monument to mediocrity. Cedric was a man whose entire sense of self-worth was tethered to the tin badge pinned to his chest. He had pale, perpetually flushed skin, a receding hairline he tried to hide with a tight buzz cut, and eyes that gleamed with a predatory, cowardly light. Still giving me the silent treatment, huh? Cedric taunted, leaning in close. His breath smelled of cheap tobacco and peppermint. He snatched Percival's belongings from a plastic evidence tray on the nearby desk and began sifting through them with exaggerated disgust. Let's see what we got here. A burner phone, no wallet, no ID, just a blank black card. What is this? A fake hotel key? You breaking into the Hyatt now? Percival's eyes tracked the black card. It wasn't a hotel key. It was a Level 5 federal auditor's cryptographic access card, tied directly to the Department of Justice. If Cedric had the brain cells to swipe it through a federal database, the entire precinct would currently be on lockdown. But Cedric was a creature of habit, blinded by his own bigotry. That card is state property, Percival said, his voice a rich, deep baritone that resonated with an unsettling authority. I highly recommend you place it back in the tray. State property? Cedric barked a laugh, looking over his shoulder. Hey, Evangeline. Come look at this. We got a regular comedian over here. Officer Evangeline stood by the water cooler, a stark contrast to the rot that filled the room. She was a rookie, barely 6 months out of the academy, with bright, anxious eyes and a uniform that still looked too stiff. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. Evangeline had watched Cedric drag Percival through the double doors. She had seen the blood on Percival's lip and the unnecessary force Cedric used to slam him onto the bench. Her stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't what she signed up for. She had joined the force to protect people, not to watch a veteran officer brutalize a man who had offered zero physical resistance. Officer Cedric, Evangeline said, her voice wavering slightly. She stepped forward, her duty boots squeaking on the linoleum. Shouldn't we run his prints? If he doesn't have an ID, standard procedure dictates we move him to processing and get a medical check on that laceration. Cedric turned his head slowly, his smirk vanishing into a hard, contemptuous glare. Standard procedure? Rookie? You think you're in a classroom? This is the street. And guys like this, he pointed a thick finger at Percival's face. They don't respect procedure, they respect consequences. He was casing the Silverline site. I was inspecting the concrete pouring techniques to ensure they met municipal code. Percival corrected, his face an emotionless mask. The contractor is using a substandard aggregate mix, violating Section 4B of the city's infrastructure ordinance. Cedric paused, his brow furrowing as his brain struggled to process the highly technical vocabulary. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in his eyes, but his arrogance quickly swallowed it whole. He sneered, stepping into Percival's personal space. "Oh, I get it. You learned some big words in the joint, didn't you? Some jailhouse lawyer taught you how to sound smart, so you could con your way out of a vagrancy charge." Cedric tossed the black access card carelessly onto the desk and leaned down, whispering venomously into Percival's ear. "You're nothing. You're a ghost in my city. I could make you disappear into the system for a week, and not a single soul would come looking for you." Percival looked up, meeting Cedric's gaze with a chilling intensity that made the veteran cop involuntarily take a half step back. Percival wasn't looking at a police officer. He was looking through him, analyzing him as a variable in a much larger equation. "You are currently operating under a catastrophic miscalculation, Officer Cedric," Percival said softly. "You believe you have power. But power is a current. You don't generate it, you only borrow it. And your lease is about to expire." Cedric's face turned violently red. The humiliation of being spoken down to by a handcuffed prisoner in front of a rookie shattered his fragile ego. He unclipped his nightstick from his belt, his knuckles turning white. "Let's see how smart you sound with a broken jaw," Cedric hissed. Evangeline dropped her clipboard. "Cedric, stop, don't do this." Before Cedric could swing, the heavy glass door to the captain's office swung open, and the sharp, rhythmic clack of expensive heels echoed across the precinct floor. Captain Araminta had arrived. Captain Araminta was a predator in a tailored charcoal suit. She wore her authority like a loaded weapon, her sharp features framed by a severe, slicked-back bob. Araminta hadn't climbed to the top of the 42nd precinct by being a beacon of justice. She had clawed her way up through political maneuvering, strategic blackmail, and an uncanny ability to make the city's undesirable problems vanish before they reached the press. She was corrupt, down to the marrow, a woman who treated the law as a mere suggestion for the wealthy and a brutal weapon against the poor. She glided onto the precinct floor, holding a steaming cup of artisan espresso, her eyes instantly assessing the scene. She saw Cedric with his baton drawn. She saw Evangeline looking panicked, and she saw the black man handcuffed to the bench, bleeding but entirely unbothered. "Cedric," Araminta said, her voice a smooth, icy drawl that instantly froze the room. "Are we redecorating the walls with suspect blood again? Because I just had the drywall patched in holding cell 3. Cedric immediately lowered his baton, though he kept it gripped tightly in his hand. "Captain Araminta." "No, ma'am. Just attitude adjustment. Caught this one prowling around the Silverline site. Refuses to identify himself. Gives me a bunch of lip about municipal codes. He's clearly trying to case the materials." Araminta took a slow sip of her espresso, her piercing green eyes locking onto Percival. She walked over, her heels clicking ominously, until she was standing directly in front of him. She looked him up and down, taking in the dirty hoodie, the scuffed boots, and the lack of visible wealth. To her, he was a nobody, a statistic, a minor annoyance on a Tuesday afternoon. "Is that right?" Araminta murmured, leaning against the edge of the desk. "A municipal code expert. How charming. We don't like prowlers in the West End, sweetheart. It upsets the taxpayers. And when the taxpayers are upset, the mayor yells at the commissioner, and the commissioner yells at me." Percival held her gaze, refusing to look down. "Captain Araminta, badge number 00412. It's fascinating to meet you in person. Your precinct has the highest rate of undocumented use of force incidents in the tri-state area. I've read the shadow ledgers." Araminta's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. The temperature in her eyes dropped to absolute zero. "Shadow ledgers? Cedric, did you pick up a schizophrenic? What is he rambling about?" "He's crazy, Captain," Cedric said eagerly, desperate for her validation. "Got this fake black card on him, probably cooked out of his mind on something." Evangeline stepped forward again, her hands trembling. "Captain, with respect, he hasn't shown any signs of intoxication. We haven't read him his rights. And Officer Cedric struck him during the arrest without provocation. I saw the dashcam feed when we pulled in. The suspect was fully compliant. Araminta turned her gaze slowly to the rookie. The look she gave Evangeline was one of utter, venomous disdain. Officer Evangeline, I wasn't aware you had been promoted to internal affairs. Did I miss the memo? No, Captain. You just nothing, Araminta snapped, her voice suddenly cracking like a whip. You are a rookie. You observe, you learn, and you keep your mouth shut until you have enough time on the job to understand how the real world works. Cedric is a decorated veteran. If he says the suspect resisted, the suspect resisted. Am I clear? Evangeline swallowed hard, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. She looked at Percival, offering a silent, desperate apology. Yes, Captain. Araminta turned back to Percival, a cruel smile playing on her lips. You see, expert, in my house, we write the reality. You are an unidentified vagrant who assaulted an officer during a lawful stop. You're going to sit in a holding cell for 72 hours while we try to figure out who you are. By the time you see a judge, you'll be begging to plead guilty to trespassing just to get out of Rikers. Percival leaned back slightly against the cold wall. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. He had been sent to investigate financial irregularities at the Silverline project, but the rot went so much deeper. It was woven into the very fabric of the city's law enforcement. He realized now that Araminta wasn't just turning a blind eye to Cedric's racism. She was weaponizing it to keep her district sterile and profitable for the elite she served. You're making a mistake that you will not be able to unmake, Captain, Percival said. His tone wasn't a threat. It was a simple, absolute statement of fact. If you process me under a John Doe assault charge, you will trigger an avalanche that will bury this entire building. Araminta laughed a cold, genuine laugh of amusement. She gestured to Cedric. He's all yours, Cedric. Teach him some manners. Off the cameras. If he's still talking like a politician in 10 minutes, I'll write you up for incompetence. Araminta turned on her heel and began walking back toward her office. Cedric grinned, his teeth bared like a rabid dog. He stepped toward Percival, raising the nightstick, sliding his hand through the leather thong for a better grip. Just you and me now, Ghost, Cedric whispered. Let's see you bleed. Percival didn't brace for the impact. He simply stared at the large, heavy double doors at the front of the precinct. He had been counting the minutes. He knew exactly who was coming. The heavy oak double doors of the 42nd precinct didn't just open. They were violently thrust apart, slamming against the plaster walls with a sound like a gunshot. The cacophony of the precinct, the ringing phones, the clacking keyboards, Cedric's sadistic chuckling died instantly. Silence plummeted over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Standing in the doorway was Reginald. The mayor of the city was an imposing figure, a man carved from mahogany and iron, standing 6'4" in a bespoke navy suit that commanded absolute reverence. Reginald possessed a presence that sucked the oxygen out of a room. He was a former district attorney known for his ruthlessness, a man who had pulled the city back from the brink of bankruptcy through sheer force of will. But today, the polished, diplomatic veneer of the mayor was gone. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek, and his dark eyes burned with an unholy, terrifying wrath. Flanking him were 4 massive men in dark suits, his elite executive protection unit, and trailing just behind them was the city police commissioner, looking pale and thoroughly terrified. Captain Araminta stopped dead in her tracks, her artisan espresso slipping from her fingers and shattering on the linoleum. The dark liquid pooled around her expensive heels, but she didn't look down. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Mayor Reginald, Araminta gasped, her voice shrill, scrambling to plaster on a welcoming smile. She rushed forward, abandoning all her previous cold composure. Sir, what an absolute honor. We weren't expecting an inspection today. If you had called ahead, I would have. Reginald didn't even look at her. He didn't acknowledge her existence. He walked right past her extended hand, moving with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. His eyes were locked like laser sights on the holding bench. Cedric was frozen mid-stride, his nightstick still raised in the air. His brain short-circuited. He looked at the mayor, then down at the black man in the dirty hoodie, then back at the mayor. Reginald stopped 5 feet from the bench. He took in the scene with terrifying precision. He saw the harsh, cutting metal of the handcuffs. He saw the bruise forming on Percival's cheek. He saw the dried blood on his son's lip. He saw the nightstick in Cedric's hand. The silence stretched, agonizing, and thick. Evangeline, standing near the water cooler, stopped breathing entirely. "Mayor Reginald, sir," Cedric stammered, his voice cracking like a pubescent boy's. He desperately tried to lower his nightstick behind his back. We're just processing a vagrant, sir. Caught him prowling the Silverline site. Routine cleanup, keeping the city safe." Reginald slowly turned his massive head to look at Cedric. The look in the mayor's eyes was so intensely violent that Cedric involuntarily whimpered and took a step back. When Reginald spoke, his voice didn't boom. It was a low, guttural rumble, vibrating with a rage so profound it seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling tiles. "Take the cuffs off him." Cedric blinked, sweat suddenly pouring down his flushed face. He looked toward Araminta for help, but the captain was paralyzed, her eyes wide with mounting horror as the pieces began to click together in her shrewd, corrupt mind. "Sir?" Cedric stuttered, trying to maintain his bravado. "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, this suspect is uncooperative and dangerous. He's a John Doe. I will not repeat myself, officer," Reginald whispered. The absolute quietness of his voice was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. He stepped into Cedric's personal space, towering over the cop. "I said, take the handcuffs off my son." "My son." The words dropped into the precinct like a tactical nuclear weapon. The shock wave was palpable. Cedric's knees actually buckled slightly. The color didn't just drain from his face. It vanished completely, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, but no sound came out. Your son?" Araminta whispered from across the room, her voice trembling violently. Her pristine, calculated world was suddenly collapsing around her. Percival, who had remained entirely still, finally moved. He leaned forward on the bench, looking up at the mayor. A faint, wry smile touched the corner of his unbusted lip. "You're late, old man," Percival said softly. "You said you'd pull me out of the field if I missed the 2 p.m. check-in. It's 3:15. Reginald's hard expression softened just a fraction as he looked down at Percival. The fierce, protective love of a father warring with his fury. Reginald had adopted Percival 20 years ago, after Percival's biological parents, crusading civil rights lawyers, were murdered in a suspicious fire. Reginald had raised him, trained him, and protected him. Percival wasn't just a son, he was Reginald's legacy. And more than that, Percival was the apex predator of the Department of Justice, a ghost auditor who went undercover to dismantle systemic corruption. "I had to deal with the commissioner," Reginald replied to Percival, his voice softening slightly before hardening into steel as he looked back at Cedric. "Officer, the keys, now." Cedric's hands were shaking so violently he could barely unclip the keys from his belt. He fumbled, dropping them onto the floor. He scrambled to his knees, a pathetic, whimpering mess, picked up the keys, and with trembling hands, unlocked the steel cuffs binding Percival's wrists. Percival stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders, rubbing the deep red indentations on his wrists. He towered over Cedric, who was still practically cowering on the floor. Percival looked at the mayor, then pointed a long finger at Cedric. "This one," Percival said, his voice ringing out clearly in the dead, silent precinct. "Illegally detained me, assaulted me with a weapon, and engaged in severe racial profiling." And that one, Percival pointed across the room to a trembling Captain Araminta, "is running a shadow ledger protecting embezzlers at the Silverline site, and just ordered this officer to beat me off camera, to force a false confession." Araminta gasped, taking a step backward, looking frantically at the doors. "Mayor Reginald, I swear, he's lying. I have no idea what he's—" "Shut your mouth, Araminta." Reginald snarled, the command cracking like thunder. He turned to his security detail. "Secure the doors. Nobody leaves this building." "Commissioner." The police commissioner stepped forward, sweating profusely. "Yes, Mr. Mayor. I want Captain Araminta and Officer Cedric stripped of their badges and their firearms. Right here, right now." Reginald commanded. Cedric let out a strangled sob. Mr. Mayor, please. I have a pension. I didn't know he was your son. If I had known. Percival stepped forward, cutting Cedric off, his dark eyes blazing with a sudden, unrestrained fire. That is exactly the point, Cedric. You didn't know. You thought I was nobody. You thought I was a ghost. You thought you could brutalize a black man simply because you believed society wouldn't care. What you did to me today, you have done to 100 men before me who didn't have a mayor for a father. Percival leaned down, his face inches from Cedric's terrified eyes. I told you power was a current, Percival whispered, and yours just got cut. The precinct air was thick enough to choke on. Mayor Reginald's executive protection unit moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a perimeter around the holding area. The police commissioner, a balding man whose complexion had turned the color of week-old oatmeal, stepped forward on trembling legs. You heard the mayor. The commissioner barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. He pointed a shaking finger at Cedric, then at Araminta. Badges and sidearms. On the desk, now. Cedric broke first. A loud, wet sob tore from his throat. He fumbled blindly at his chest, his thick, clumsy fingers struggling with the pin of his badge. The tin shield hit the linoleum floor with a pathetic, hollow clatter. Next came his duty belt. The heavy black leather, weighed down with the Glock 19, the taser, and the spare magazines, dropped to the floor, pooling around his ankles like shed skin. He sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands, rocking back and forth. The veteran cop, who only minutes ago had gleefully threatened to break a man's jaw, was now a weeping, formless puddle of terror. Araminta, however, did not weep. The initial shock that had paralyzed her was evaporating, replaced by a toxic, calculating venom. She was a survivor. She had navigated the shark-infested waters of municipal politics and organized crime for a decade. She slowly straightened her posture, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the lapel of her tailored charcoal suit. She did not reach for her badge. Instead, she took 3 slow, deliberate steps backward until her hips pressed against the edge of the precinct's main dispatch terminal. You are a very impressive man, Reginald, Araminta said. Her voice was no longer shrill. It had dropped into a low, terrifyingly calm register. You've built a beautiful narrative for this city. The tough-on-crime prosecutor who became a savior, the loving adoptive father. She tilted her head, her green eyes locking onto Percival. And you, the ghost auditor, the phantom sword of the DOJ. Save the eulogy, Araminta. Reginald growled, his massive frame radiating lethal intent. Hand over the weapon. Araminta smiled. It was a thin, razor-sharp expression that sent a chill down the spine of the commissioner. I don't think you fully appreciate the architecture of this building, Mr. Mayor. This precinct wasn't just renovated last year, it was fortified. Before anyone could react, Araminta slammed her palm down hard onto a hidden biometric scanner flush against the dispatch desk. A deafening, mechanical siren instantly shattered the silence of the room, wailing with a bone-rattling intensity. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered and died, immediately replaced by the blood-red glow of emergency tactical lighting. Then came the sound of grinding steel. Heavy, 3-inch thick titanium blast shutters slammed down over the precinct's double doors, locking into the floor with a concussive boom that shook the concrete under their feet. Simultaneously, identical steel plates dropped over every window, dispatch slit, and exit route in the building. The 42nd precinct had just become an impenetrable, airtight vault. The mayor's security detail instantly drew their weapons, forming a tight, 360-degree phalanx around Reginald and Percival. The commissioner let out a high-pitched yelp, diving behind a row of filing cabinets. Evangeline, the young rookie, dropped to her knees, clapping her hands over her ears to block out the siren, her eyes wide with mounting panic as the reality of their entrapment set in. What the hell have you done? Reginald roared over the siren, his gun drawn and aimed directly at Araminta's chest. Araminta unholstered her pearl-handled sidearm, but she didn't point it at the mayor. She pointed it at the ceiling. From the shadows of the locker rooms and the holding cells, 12 heavily armed precinct officers stepped out. These weren't standard beat cops. These were Araminta's loyalists. the inner circle of her corrupt regime. They leveled their service weapons and shotguns directly at the mayor's detail. They had the mayor outgunned 3-1. Araminta tapped a sequence into the dispatch terminal, killing the siren so her voice could be heard. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating in the red emergency light. Protocol 731, Mr. Mayor, Araminta announced, her eyes gleaming with sociopathic triumph. In the event of a catastrophic terrorist breach, the precinct enters total lockdown. External communications are severed. Cellular signals are jammed by the copper mesh in the walls. We are completely off the grid. You are insane. The commissioner whimpered from behind the cabinets. You can't lock down the mayor. The city will tear this building apart block by block. They will, Araminta agreed, her smile widening into something genuinely monstrous. But only after I trigger the distress beacon. And do you know what the distress beacon will transmit, Commissioner? It will transmit a tragic, heart-wrenching audio feed of a radicalized extremist, an unidentified black man you brought into my precinct, taking the mayor hostage, executing his security detail, and ultimately murdering the mayor before my brave officers could put him down. Cedric, still on his knees, looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. Captain, you can't. You're talking about executing the mayor of the city. We'll all hang. We will be heroes, Cedric. She snapped coldly. We will be the tragic survivors of a terror attack. The federal government will pour billions into our department. She turned her gaze back to Percival. You thought you cornered a rat, auditor, but you just locked yourself in a cage with a lion. Percival didn't flinch. He stood tall in the center of the crossfire, the red emergency lighting casting sharp, demonic shadows across his face. He looked at the steel blast doors, then at the 12 armed officers, and finally, he looked back at Araminta. You are right about one thing, Captain, Percival said softly, his deep baritone cutting through the tension like a straight razor. This room is a cage, but you are terribly confused about who the animal is. Araminta let out a dry, mocking laugh, pacing slowly behind the wall of her armed officers. Bravado to the very end. I suppose I should respect it. But words won't stop bullets, auditor, and your federal badge means absolutely nothing inside this vault. My badge isn't what you should be worried about, Percival replied smoothly. He reached into his pocket. Every officer in the room tensed, fingers tightening on their triggers. Reginald stepped forward, partially shielding his son, his own weapon rock steady. But Percival didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out the matte black level 5 access card Cedric had mocked earlier. You think your corruption is localized to money laundering, Araminta? Percival said, holding the card up in the dim red light. You think the DOJ sent me here because you were skimming from the Silverline Development Project's budget, but we don't care about the concrete. We care about what you've been doing beneath it. Araminta's smug expression faltered. A microsecond of genuine fear flashed in her green eyes, quickly masked by rage. Shut him up, she hissed to her lieutenant. Wait. Reginald barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Speak, Percy. Tell these officers exactly what they are pointing their guns to protect. Percival turned his gaze to the 12 loyalist cops, his eyes locking onto them one by one. Silverline isn't a luxury condo project. It's a privately funded subterranean detention center, a black site built on municipal land, completely off the books, funded by private prison conglomerates. The precinct was dead silent, save for the hum of the red emergency lights. Evangeline, huddled by the water cooler, gasped aloud. For the last 2 years, the homeless population of the West End hasn't been relocating. Percival continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. They've been vanishing. Undocumented immigrants, runaways, the marginalized the people society looks away from. The people Officer Cedric arrests on bogus vagrancy charges. Percival pointed a long, accusing finger directly at Cedric, who flinched as if he'd been struck by lightning. You thought you were just harassing people you didn't like, Cedric, Percival said, his voice dripping with venom. You thought you were cleaning up the streets and throwing them in holding cells to teach them a lesson. But did you ever wonder why Captain Araminta always handled their transfer paperwork personally? Did you ever check the county jail logs to see if they arrived? Cedric's eyes widened to the size of saucers. His breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. He looked at Araminta, his mind trying to violently reject the horrifying truth. Captain, the transfers, the John Does, where did they go? Araminta's face was a mask of furious, pale stone. She didn't answer him. They went into the ground, Cedric. Percival boomed. Araminta has been selling human beings, trafficking them directly from this precinct into the subterranean levels of the Silverline project to be used as forced, unpaid labor to excavate the site off the grid. Hundreds of men and women, locked in the dark, effectively enslaved by the commander of the 42nd Precinct. The horrific weight of the revelation crashed down on the room. Several of the loyalist cops lowered their weapons an inch or two, exchanging nervous, terrified glances. They had taken bribes to look the other way on drug deals and protection rackets. But human trafficking? Slavery? That was a line none of them realized they had crossed. It's a lie, Araminta shrieked, her polished veneer shattering entirely. She aimed her gun wildly at Percival. He's trying to divide us. Shoot them. If they leave this room, we all go to federal prison for treason. Shoot them now. No one is shooting anyone, Percival said quietly. He pressed his thumb against the center of the black level 5 access card. A tiny, imperceptible biometric reader scanned his print, and a microscopic blue light began pulsing on the edge of the card. You told us the walls have a copper mesh to block cellular signals, Captain, Percival said, holding the pulsing card up. And that's true. Standard radio frequency is dead in here. But this card isn't using radio frequency. It's an ultra-low frequency seismic transmitter. It uses the physical foundation of the building to send a binary pulse directly to the DOJ mobile command center parked precisely 2 blocks away. Araminta's eyes tracked the pulsing blue light, absolute terror finally seizing her throat. I didn't come here to arrest you today, Araminta, Percival whispered, the trap finally springing shut. I came here to verify the biometric lockdown protocol. I needed you to seal the building, because while you thought you were locking us in, Percival's smile was utterly devoid of mercy. You were actually sealing the vault so none of your officers could escape the raid. The heavy, suffocating silence of the sealed precinct was suddenly shattered by a sound that defied logic. It wasn't the sound of sirens or bullhorns. It was the sound of the earth itself cracking open. A massive, concussive thud vibrated up through the soles of their shoes, rattling the fillings in their teeth. The heavy titanium blast doors covering the main entrance bowed violently inward, the thick steel groaning like a dying beast. Araminta stumbled backward, dropping her pearl-handled sidearm in sheer shock. Impossible, she breathed, her eyes wide. Those doors are rated for C4 explosives. They can't be breached. They aren't using explosives, Captain, a new voice rang out. Everyone turned. Evangeline, the trembling rookie who had been cowering near the water cooler, stood up. Her posture had completely changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal professionalism. She unclipped her radio, letting it drop to the floor, and drew her service weapon, aiming it directly at the back of the loyalist lieutenant's head. They're using a Bearcat armored breaching vehicle with a hydraulic ram, Evangeline stated calmly. She looked over at Percival and gave a brief, sharp nod. Reginald stared at the young officer in astonishment. You're not a rookie. Special Agent Evangeline Vance, FBI Public Corruption Task Force, Evangeline said, her eyes never leaving the lieutenant. I've been deep cover in this precinct for 8 months, Mayor. We needed physical access to Araminta's encrypted transfer logs to prove the human trafficking ring, but her server was air-gapped. I needed a distraction big enough to pull her away from her terminal so I could insert a localized decryptor. She nodded toward Percival. Getting the mayor's son, a high-level federal auditor, falsely arrested and beaten in her lobby, was the perfect distraction. Cedric let out a horrific, guttural wail. His entire reality had been a meticulously engineered stage play. He hadn't asserted his dominance over a helpless black man. He had been perfectly manipulated, his own vile racism weaponized against him to dismantle the very empire he thought he was protecting. He had been the bait, the hook, and the sinking weight all at once. Boom. The second strike from the hydraulic ram tore the titanium hinges completely out of the reinforced concrete walls. The massive blast doors, weighing thousands of pounds, collapsed inward, slamming onto the linoleum floor with an apocalyptic crash that kicked up a massive cloud of plaster dust and debris. Through the settling dust, the blinding white glare of military-grade spotlights pierced the red emergency lighting. Dozens of heavily armored tactical agents flooded through the breach. They wore black Kevlar, tactical helmets, and carried compact submachine guns. The letters FBI and DOJ were emblazoned in stark white across their chests. They moved with terrifying efficiency, a flood of righteous fury pouring into the corrupt precinct. Federal agents, weapons down, drop them now. The 12 loyalist cops didn't even hesitate. The illusion of their power was obliterated in an instant. They threw their shotguns and pistols to the floor, dropping to their knees and lacing their fingers behind their heads. Araminta stood frozen, the flashing blue and red lights from the armored vehicles outside washing over her pale face. Her fortress had been turned into a tomb. Her legacy was ash. Two massive FBI tactical agents grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, slamming her face first against the wall and violently wrenching her arms behind her back. The harsh ratcheting sound of heavy steel zip ties echoing in her ears was the final, devastating period on her reign of terror. Percival walked slowly through the chaotic scene, stepping over the discarded weapons and the weeping forms of the corrupt officers. He approached Cedric, who was still curled in a ball on the floor, babbling incoherently, his mind utterly broken by the weight of his crimes and his catastrophic stupidity. Percival looked down at the man who had kicked him, mocked him, and threatened his life. There was no anger left in Percival's eyes, only a profound, freezing pity. "You told me I didn't belong in this zip code, Cedric," Percival said softly, his voice cutting through the noise of the arrests. Cedric looked up, his face streaked with tears and snot, his eyes begging for a mercy he didn't deserve. "Please. I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Percival replied. "But you are going to learn a new zip code very soon, a federal penitentiary code. And when you are sitting in a cell, I want you to remember that it wasn't a mayor or an auditor who destroyed you. It was your own hatred, your own arrogance. That is what built your cage." Percival turned his back on the broken cop, walking toward the shattered entrance of the precinct where his father, Mayor Reginald, was waiting. The storm had passed, and the heavy, undeniable scales of justice had finally balanced. The dust from the shattered titanium blast doors was still settling over the 42nd precinct, catching the harsh white glare of the FBI spotlights like falling snow. The once impenetrable fortress was now a chaotic triage zone of federal authority. Araminta's loyalist officers were on their knees, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, their faces painted with the terrifying realization that their reign of terror was over. Araminta herself was slammed against the dispatch desk by two massive tactical agents. Her tailored charcoal suit was ruined, covered in plaster and debris, but her green eyes still burned with a toxic, unyielding defiance. Special Agent Evangeline Vance stood in the center of the room, a heavy radio pressed to her ear. She was coordinating the rapid response. "Alpha Team, mount up in the Bearcats. You have the GPS coordinates for the Silverline Development Project. Expect heavy cartel resistance. Secure the subterranean levels and locate the holding pins. Do not let them purge the site." "Wait." Percival's voice cut through the noise, deep and resonant, vibrating with sudden, intense alarm. Evangeline lowered her radio, turning to face him. Mayor Reginald, who had been speaking quietly with his security detail, stepped closer. Percival was staring intently at the matte black level 5 access card in his hand. The microscopic blue light on the edge was still pulsing, but it was now synced to a digital readout on a federal datapad he had commandeered from an FBI technician. He was analyzing the localized seismic data the card had transmitted to the DOJ command center. "Evangeline, call the strike team off," Percival ordered, his brow furrowing into a deep, dangerous V. "Silverline is a decoy." "A decoy?" Mayor Reginald echoed, his voice sharp. "Percy, we have the transfer logs." Evangeline pulled them from the incinerator. They point directly to the Silverline coordinates. "Numbers on a page can be falsified, old man," Percival said, his fingers flying across the datapad, bringing up a 3-dimensional topographic map of the city block. "My card didn't just breach the firewall. It pinged the geological foundation to find the structural voids used for the holding cells. Look at the return telemetry. He held up the screen. The area beneath the Silverline development project glowed solid green. Solid bedrock. There are no hollow pillars at Silverline. They just poured thousands of tons of concrete into the ground to launder the money. It's an empty shell. Evangeline's face went pale. Then where are the victims? Where are the missing people? A low, dark, and utterly psychotic laugh echoed across the ruined precinct. Araminta tilted her head back against the wall, her lips pulled back in a ghastly, triumphant smile. You federal boys are so obsessed with following the money, you never bother to look at what you're standing on. Percival's dark eyes snapped from the datapad to the floor of the precinct. The topographic map on his screen wasn't glowing green directly beneath them. It was glowing a terrifying, hollow red. A massive, labyrinthine structure extending stories deep beneath the 42nd precinct itself. The old Prohibition-era subway tunnels, Mayor Reginald breathed, the blood draining from his face. They were decommissioned in the 1930s. The city sealed them off, but the access grates are located in the sub-basement evidence locker. Percival finished, the horrifying reality clicking into place. You didn't need to transport them to the West End. You were keeping them directly under our feet the entire time. Araminta's smile widened into a sneer of pure malice. Transporting human cargo across the city is a logistical nightmare, auditor. Why risk a traffic stop when I can just walk the John does down a flight of stairs? The cartel uses the abandoned rail lines to move them straight to the harbor. You're a monster, Evangeline whispered, her hand instinctively drifting to her sidearm. I'm an entrepreneur, Araminta shot back, but I wasn't the CEO. Percival's mind raced. He looked around the chaotic room, scanning the faces of the arrested cops, the federal agents, and the mayor's detail. Someone was missing. The man who had been cowering behind the filing cabinets when the blast doors fell. Where is the police commissioner? Percival roared, his voice shaking the remaining glass in the windows. Araminta laughed again, a sound like grinding glass. He's not a coward, Percival. He's the architect. He approved the Silverline decoy budget, and right now, he's in the sub-basement. Because while you were busy breaking down my front door, he went downstairs to initiate the purge protocol. You're too late. The tide is coming in. The precinct sub-basement was a relic of the 1970s, a massive, concrete cavern filled with towering shelves of forgotten evidence boxes, chain-link cages, and flickering, jaundiced fluorescent lights. But at the very back of the cavern, hidden behind a false wall of steel lockers, was a heavy, motorized blast door leading into the forgotten depths of the city. The door was standing wide open. Percival, Evangeline, and Mayor Reginald sprinted through the evidence room, flanked by 6 heavily armed FBI tactical agents. They plunged through the blast door and onto a rusted, winding iron staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air instantly dropped 20 degrees, smelling of stagnant water, rust, and terror. Night vision, Evangeline ordered, pulling her tactical goggles down. The darkness bloomed into a grainy, luminous green. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they entered a massive, vaulted subway station that hadn't seen a passenger in a century. But it wasn't empty. Lining the crumbling concrete platforms were dozens of reinforced steel shipping containers, modified with air vents and heavy padlocks. And from inside those containers came the muffled, desperate sounds of weeping, screaming, and the frantic pounding of fists against steel. Standing on the edge of the platform, illuminated by the harsh glow of portable halogen work lights, was the police commissioner. He had shed his suit jacket, his usually doughy face transformed into a mask of cold, calculating ruthlessness. He was standing next to an enormous, rusted industrial valve wheel, the main floodgate for the city's subterranean reservoir. 2 cartel enforcers with submachine guns stood by his side. Federal agents, step away from the valve, Evangeline screamed, raising her weapon. The cartel enforcers immediately raised their weapons to fire, but the FBI tactical team was vastly superior. A synchronized volley of suppressed gunfire echoed through the cavern, and both enforcers dropped to the concrete before they could pull their triggers. The commissioner didn't even flinch. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he grabbed a heavy steel wrench from a nearby toolbox and violently smashed it into the locking mechanism of the industrial valve, shattering the ancient cast iron. A deep, terrifying rumble shook the cavern. A massive geyser of dark, freezing water erupted from the ruptured pipe, instantly flooding the lower tracks and beginning to rapidly rise toward the platform where the shipping containers sat. "You're finished, Commissioner," Mayor Reginald bellowed, keeping his weapon trained on the man who had betrayed the entire city. "Step away." The commissioner turned to face them, his expensive dress shoes already soaking in the rising water. The cowardice he had displayed upstairs had been a flawless act. This was a man who had sold thousands of souls for offshore billions, entirely devoid of human empathy. "I am finished in this city, Reginald," the commissioner said smoothly, his voice echoing over the roar of the rushing water. "But my retirement accounts are decentralized. I just needed to clean up the loose ends." He gestured to the shipping containers. "These people have seen my face. They know the cartel routes. They are a liability. In 10 minutes, this entire station will be submerged. The water pressure will crush those containers." He stepped backward, toward a small, motorized rail cart idling on the only dry track leading into the deep tunnels toward the harbor. "You can't save them all, Auditor," the commissioner taunted, looking directly at Percival. "The locks are heavy-grade titanium. By the time you cut through even half of them, the rest will drown. You have to choose, chase me or watch them die." The commissioner jumped into the rail cart and slammed the throttle forward. The electric motor whined, and he began to speed away into the pitch-black tunnel. Evangeline cursed, taking aim at the fleeing cart, but the angle was impossible. The water was rising incredibly fast, already lapping at the bottom edges of the shipping containers. The screams from inside grew utterly frantic. "Evangeline, your breaching shotgun," Percival yelled, pointing at the heavy weapon slung over her back. "Blow the locks. Tactical team, form a human chain. Get these people up the stairs." Evangeline didn't hesitate. She ran to the first container, pressed the muzzle of the breacher's shotgun against the heavy padlock, and fired. The lock shattered. Percival ripped the heavy steel doors open. Dozens of terrified, freezing men and women spilled out, coughing and sobbing. "Move! Up the stairs! Go! Go! Go!" Reginald roared, holstering his weapon and physically hoisting a frail, elderly woman into his arms, carrying her toward the iron staircase. Percival turned his eyes toward the dark tunnel where the commissioner had fled. The mastermind thought he had created the perfect distraction. He thought he could buy his freedom with the lives of the innocent. Percival's jaw clenched. He was a ghost auditor. He didn't just balance the books. He collected the debts. "Evangeline, handle the evacuation," Percival shouted, stripping off his heavy Kevlar vest so he could move faster. Before she could stop him, Percival dove off the platform into the freezing, waist-deep water, wading furiously after the fleeing rail cart. The water in the tunnel was rising with terrifying speed, threatening to sweep Percival off his feet, but he drove forward with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. The motorized rail cart wasn't built for speed, it was built for hauling cargo. Percival could see the red taillight glowing faintly in the darkness ahead. The commissioner looked back over his shoulder, his eyes widening in shock as he saw the massive silhouette of the black man he had dismissed as a vagrant tearing through the water after him. "Die, you persistent bastard," the commissioner screamed, pulling a small revolver from his ankle holster and firing wildly into the dark. A bullet grazed Percival's shoulder, tearing through the fabric of his hoodie and drawing a hot line of blood. But Percival didn't even break stride. The pain was irrelevant. The mission was absolute. Up ahead, the tunnel began to incline sharply toward the harbor exit. The electric motor of the rail cart whined in protest, struggling against the sudden gradient and the weight of the water now flooding the tracks. The cart slowed to a crawl. Percival lunged. He breached the water like a leviathan, grabbing the rear steel bumper of the cart with both hands. The metal groaned under his grip. He hauled himself up onto the back of the moving platform. The commissioner screamed in sheer terror, dropping his empty revolver and scrambling toward the front of the cart to grab a heavy iron pry bar. He swung it wildly at Percival's head. Percival ducked seamlessly beneath the arc of the heavy iron. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't strike the man. Instead, he reached out and locked his massive hands onto the lapels of the commissioner's soaked dress shirt. With a single, Explosive heave. Percival lifted the corrupt official entirely off his feet and hurled him backward off the cart. The commissioner slammed into the freezing, rushing water with a loud splash. He gasped, thrashing wildly as the current immediately began to drag him back down the incline, back toward the flooded subway station he had just tried to drown. Percival slammed his fist down on the cart's emergency brake. Sparks flew from the undercarriage as the wheels locked, grinding to a halt on the incline, safe above the rising waterline. Down in the dark, the commissioner was screaming, desperately clawing at the slick, moss-covered walls of the tunnel, but the water was too deep, the current too strong. The very trap he had sprung to murder hundreds of innocent people was now dragging him into the abyss. "Auditor, help me!" the commissioner shrieked, his head bobbing below the freezing black water. "I have money, I have millions, I can give you anything." Percival stood on the edge of the rail cart, looking down at the drowning mastermind. His dark eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the depths of the ocean. He pulled his level 5 access card from his pocket, the small blue light still pulsing in the dark. "You can't bribe a ghost, Commissioner," Percival's deep voice echoed ominously off the tunnel walls. "And you can't buy your way out of hell." Percival didn't shoot him. He didn't have to. He simply watched as the commissioner's frantic thrashing weakened, until the rushing waters of his own creation finally pulled him under into the suffocating dark. 20 minutes later, the main water line was shut off by the city's emergency services. Back on the platform, it was a scene of exhausted, weeping salvation. The FBI tactical team, led by Evangeline and Mayor Reginald, had successfully blown the locks on every single shipping container. Over 200 victims, cold, wet, but alive, were being wrapped in thermal blankets and escorted up the iron stairs toward freedom. Among the federal agents assisting the victims was Officer Cedric. He wasn't acting as a cop. He was in handcuffs, his badge stripped, being forced by Evangeline to physically carry the stretchers of the very people he had wrongfully arrested and funneled into this nightmare. Cedric's face was an absolute mask of devastation. Every time a victim looked at him with terror, shrinking away from his uniform, a piece of his soul died. He was witnessing the true, horrifying consequence of his arrogance and bigotry. His punishment wasn't just prison. It was the inescapable, crushing weight of his own monstrous reality. Percival waded back onto the platform, his clothes soaked, blood dripping off his shoulder. Reginald rushed forward, throwing a heavy thermal blanket over his son's shoulders, pulling him into a fierce, tight embrace. "You did it, Percy. You brought them all home." Percival looked over the sea of survivors, his eyes lingering on the broken, weeping form of Cedric, and then up toward the stairs where Araminta was being hauled away to a life of absolute isolation in a supermax cell. The commissioner was gone, swallowed by his own greed. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. "No, old man," Percival whispered, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "We did it." And that is the explosive, mind-bending conclusion to the 42nd Precinct conspiracy. From a horrific betrayal disguised as a municipal project to a deadly flooding labyrinth right beneath their feet, the corrupt learned the hardest lesson of all. When you try to bury the innocent, you only end up digging your own grave. Araminta lost her empire, Cedric lost his mind to guilt, and the commissioner was swallowed by his own trap. If you love this intense story of karma, ultimate justice, and the unstoppable power of a ghost auditor, please hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm you want more thrilling content like this. Share this video with someone who loves seeing the corrupt get exactly what they deserve. And make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic audio tale. Remember, no matter how deep the darkness goes, justice will always find a way to break through. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.